afternoon, virtual conventioneers. So when Rachel asked me to do this video, her stipulation was that I do something happy and positive. And those of you who know me well know I don't really do happy and positive. In fact, ever since the 4th grade, this has been my affirmation. Clearly, social distancing is not a problem for me, though perhaps some creative person can redo this into, I love doll collectors, it's people I can't stand. What makes me happy? Well, what has made me happy for many, many years were Raggedy Ann and Andy. So I am going to take you on a little trip down memory lane with my collection of Raggedy Ann and Andys. My parents always said that I was bitten by the Raggedy bug, and I did have, even as a child, quite a collection of dolls, toys, games, puzzles, all featuring Raggedy Ann and Andy. That period is almost exactly 1960 through the late 1970s. No secrets, I was born in March 1959. So this is going to be a nice overview of that sort of second golden period of Raggedy Ann and Andy. So you can see to my right a few of the dolls that belonged to me as a child. And we are going to start with the number one, at least the number one to me. And this is my first childhood Raggedy Andy. So this doll would have been purchased late in '59 or early in 1960. And according to my mother's story, she had taken me out for one of my very first trips to a store. I would have been under 1 year old, and I grabbed a hold of this doll and would not let go. And I screamed bloody murder every time my mother tried to take this away from me, and so she had to pay the whopping price of $1.50 in order to make me happy. And it was a good investment because this doll has made me happy for many, many, many years. This is sort of a late Georgene, but not so late as to be into the twisted mouth period. The doll has a rather unusual face, and the only reason I can think of for this in a doll that was made by the thousands is that they actually printed the red for a 20-inch doll by mistake because the nose is larger and the placement of the mouth is a little different than on a normal 15-inch doll. This doll, aside from being my friend and companion for many, many years, has also met every president from JFK through Ronald Reagan. In fact, he was at the California Ball for Ronald Reagan's inauguration. So yes, he has managed to get around. So this is him. I also have to show you that my brother, the heart surgeon, decided to, and he really is a heart surgeon, experiment on Raggedy Andy when he was younger. So this is what remains of his candy heart. So this was my very first doll. This Raggedy Ann would have come soon after. She's also sort of that late Georgene, but not a twisted face or twisted smile doll. She has a rather interesting fabric. The fabrics on these dolls varied wildly because Georgene novelties didn't have fabric printed. They basically got the bolt ends from the women's clothing industry. And so you quite often will find these fabrics on house dresses and aprons of the period. And that's also why there is an enormous variety in the clothes for the Georgene dolls. This particular fabric comes in at least 2 other colorways, and that's actually one of the fun parts about the Georgenes is just all the different dress fabrics that are used on them. This is sort of the typical face. She has the typical I love you heart. Now, this is some really lousy beginning sewing on my part, but these dolls were originally, the clothing was closed with safety pins, which of course would not be child safe and not be done today. But that was how things were done in the late 50s or early 60s. This doll is probably not in the correct sequence for my acquiring dolls, but it is a 15-inch doll, so I'm going to throw her in here. This was a doll that actually I conned out, not actually from a neighbor's daughter, but from the neighbor who thought her daughter was too old to play with dolls. So the damage to the nose was there when I got her. But this was another addition, and you can see yet another type of fabric, more traditional floral on her. Now these dolls are, when we talk about the twisted mouth dolls, and these are later Georgene period. I really have no idea why the change in the mouth. It doesn't sort of correspond with any change in the artwork or anything like that. So they just felt they needed to change the face for some reason. He is a bit special, or at least I have a story about him, because these 2 dolls were both Christmas presents. And I wanted a Raggedy Andy with a pink check shirt. I had wanted a 15-inch doll just like my other dolls, but apparently my parents couldn't find one. And they did find apparently a very good salesperson, because I ended up not only with a 25-inch doll with a check shirt, but I ended up with a matching Anne. Again, this sort of rose and berry print is very common on dolls from this period, and does seem to come in at least 2 other colorways. Now, also interesting on him is you can see the transition to red hair as opposed to orange. They seem to be using up the orange and changing over to the red on this doll. So these are late Georgenes. The other thing of interest, which you can see more on the Andy, is child safety regulations have kicked in, and they now have the snaps on the back as opposed to the safety pin closures, which they would have had originally. This doll, I'm afraid I have to fake with a photograph, but he was not in the bin I thought he would be. I do still have the doll, but just couldn't get it together for this program. He is a 32-inch Georgene doll. He actually would date from the very early 50s, possibly even the late 40s. I got this doll because my parents did that thing you should never, ever, ever do. Make a promise to a child. I had had some trouble sleeping through the night, and the reward for sleeping through the night for a certain period of time was that I could have anything I wanted from the toy store. Now, I think my parents expected me to choose anything I wanted from my eye level and not point up to the area above all the shelves where the large display Raggedy Andy was, and decide that that is what I wanted. But my parents did decide that a promise was a promise. I have to show you, this is not a Raggedy character. This is a clown made by Gund, and he was purchased with S&H green stamps. But for me, in my childhood, this was my Cleety the Clown. And it was important to have the other characters. So in my nursery, this was Cleety the Clown. And those next two dolls are very special dolls to me. And they will look familiar because they're in the opening of the video. Sorry, I just dropped a stand. And here's Andy. And these dolls were made by my babysitter, Mrs. Patton. And I think I would have been 5 years old when I got these dolls. These are made from the McCall's 820 pattern, which dated from the very early 40s. So this is an excellent example of how a pattern could still have been in use 25 years or so after it first came out. I have distinct memories of Mrs. Patton asking me if I was okay with the dolls having those kind of googly-eyed plastic eyes. She apparently had an enormous trouble finding plain black buttons for the eyes. Also interesting that the dolls do have this sort of brownish red hair. Not even, I mean, kind of like the early Georgenes, but almost going back to Volans, that may have just had to do with what was available. I could tell you that the dress fabric for this doll was left over from one of Mrs. Patton's house dresses. So this doll matched, had a matching dress with Mrs. Patton. Unfortunately, as a child, I did not appreciate the pink and gray color scheme, and I asked her to make another dress, which she did. And then she also made pajamas for the two of them. And Raggedy Andy has a toy monkey with a matching outfit to his. Mrs. Patton also, before she moved away, gave me her Cupid doll, which I still have. And then my father painted a painting of Raggedy Andy. Now, this painting was, I think, given to me for my birthday, and it mysteriously disappeared. And sometime about the time I was going off to college, I managed to find it in the garage where my mom had hidden it because she didn't want, I think it was more about the fact she didn't want me to have something that had been painted by my father, more than having Raggedy Ann and Andy. But you may have noticed that I did not have any Knickerbocker dolls. I was sort of before the Knickerbocker period. I would have been about 5 when they took over. I did have this Knickerbocker marionette, and this is really one of the things that prompted Knickerbocker to try and get the license away from Georgene Novelties. This is essentially a doll. It's a very flat doll. It is basically stuffed with a sheet of industrial felt, but it has a separate dress and a separate apron. There is at least one example of this more firmly stuffed, and the earliest versions may have actually been essentially strung dolls. Georgene Novelties threw a fit that Knickerbocker was making dolls, even if they were strung as marionettes, and demanded that these be withdrawn from the market. They are, in fact, very hard to find. I might even say rare, and I don't use that word often. These are the hand puppets that would have coordinated with the Knickerbocker Raggedy Ann marionette. And the marionette was not available as a Raggedy Andy. These are also from my childhood. These were some of my favorite toys, and all of these items are representative of what I called the second golden age. Uh, um, in the 40s and 50s, the Gruelle family tried to do the character licensing on their own. And by the 50s, things were pretty dark. Basically, the only licenses they had were essentially after the fact licenses. In other words, they would have found someone who was using the Raggedy Ann image illegally and then said, look, we're not going to shut you down. We're just going to insist that you purchase the license from us. And in 1961, Myrtle Gruelle got kind of fed up with this and signed the licensing rights over to the Bobbs Merrill Company. And that was probably the best thing she ever did. There was a lot of wonderful merchandise that came out in this period, and some of it's really interesting that's in the, as I say, the late Georgene period before Knickerbocker got a hold of the license for the dolls. This is another Knickerbocker item. This is a savings bank. This was mine as a child. You can see my artistic attempts down here. But this is another early Knickerbocker pre-doll item. Knickerbocker had the license to do a lot of Raggedy merchandise, but just not the dolls. I also had a plush hassock that Knickerbocker made before they got the license for the dolls. That is, I think, the one Raggedy Ann thing I actively did not keep. In addition to the bank, Knickerbocker also did this vinyl doll. The arms and head move, the rest of the doll is static, but this would have been a washable doll for a very young child. So the two bendy dolls on either side did belong to me as a child. Not quite sure why Raggedy Ann has aged far worse than Raggedy Andy. And these were Knickerbocker items. They were made to compete with the Dakin posable dolls of the time. But I'm showing these with a Raggedy Ann that did not belong to me, but you will notice that the dress fabric on the doll is identical to the dress fabric on the bendy item. This is because in the early years of Knickerbocker, they outsourced the manufacture of the dolls, but they kept trying different countries. So this was the Japan version, and this is the fabric that is found on the Japanese dolls. This was why the two of them have the same fabric. They were both made in Japan. Pretty much the Hong Kong, Taiwan, wherever they were made, there is a different fabric. And this is one of the things that can make collecting early Knickerbockers interesting, in that there actually are many different dress fabrics. We tend to only know the 4 or 5 that were used for about 20 years, but these early fabrics were probably only used for a year or two, and so that can be an interesting sort of sub-collection if you want to start collecting. So this is a set of paper dolls. I had this set as a child. Obviously I didn't have this particular set because I cut mine out and played with them. Of course, who couldn't resist playing with these? So there is Marcella, Raggedy Ann, and Raggedy Andy. And here is some of their clothing. I guess I should actually go back and do this. I do find it kind of a hoot that Raggedy Ann and Andy are all very carefully covered up, so there is no dolly nudity here. Of course, Facebook would be very happy with this. But so there's their nightwear. And even in the 60s, the illustrations with Beloved Belindy were the same. This particular set is actually dated 1957, so this could have been the set that I had. And for some reason, these school outfits always appealed to me. I think they were my favorite outfits in the set. And then there's the play clothes here. And Marcella has a little dress-up outfit. And the brown dress was my favorite dress for Marcella. So this is the cover, which if you look down here, actually says Ethel H. Sims as opposed to Ethel Hayes. So there was a marriage somewhere between her work in the 40s and this work in 1957. This set was done in the 40s. The 1957 copyright date would only apply to this particular cover. You can see that the illustrations are very much of the Georgene period as opposed to the Knickerbocker period. These actually look very much like the larger, say 32-inch Georgene Raggedy Andy's. I love this at the bottom where it says approved by handwriting authorities. Like, what the heck is a handwriting authority? Could you be any more vague? But this is the note paper, which I think is kind of wonderful, even as a child. Oops, let's see what we're going to do here. They're all based on the Grell illustrations, but they've been adapted, so they were a bit more of the time, also a bit easier to print with the two-color printing. But and I love the fact that it goes from pink background to blue backgrounds, and I think that may have been all the images. But this was a set that I still have my set. For some reason, on my set, I decided to color code everything by putting pink crayon dots on the stationery and pink crayon dots on the envelope. So I would be able to put the correct envelope with the correct stationery. So yes, that's the way I was as a child. And I wanted to show this because I love the fact it says published by Stupid. But this has the date of 1961 and the Bobbs Merrill Company, which is an interesting way to date things. Before 1961, it would have been the Johnny Gruelle Company, and after 1961, it's Bobbs Merrill. This fabric is from my childhood, at least the panel on the right. Originally, it was part of a dress that belonged to the daughter of one of my mother's childhood friends. When the girl outgrew the dress went to me. The concept was eventually a pillow was going to be made out of it, but it never happened. Unfortunately, I got my hands on it and tried to cut it down to fit my 25-inch Raggedy Ann. That was a disaster. I basically ruined the dress, so all that is left is this panel. The panel on the left is what the fabric looked like new. I have shown it with the stationery box to show you that the colorways are very similar, and I don't think that that was unintentional. Actually, the brown-red colorway on this fabric is by far the most common. There is a blue colorway and a green colorway. The green colorway I have only been able to find in this apron. I have never found it in any other form. The blue colorway is a little more common, but not nearly as common as the brown red colorway. The other thing to notice is that this is very much of the Georgene period. in the early 60s, there was some wonderful items that were licensed by the Bobbs Merrill Company before Knickerbocker got the rights to the dolls. The other thing about this image is that it was used on a set of California pottery salt and pepper shakers. As far as I know, the only items made were the salt and pepper shaker, which is a little odd because usually a company will not license the image to something that is quite that narrow. I know salt and pepper shakers sort of as a thing are popular, but so this is the banner tea set from the early 1960s. And this was, again, something I had as a child. Again, this is not mine. Mine was played with. But I love the cardboard illustrations on the cover. I think these are, again, really nice sort of illustrations of Raggedy Ann and Andy. And then this is the tea set. And the graphics on the tinware, I think, are wonderful. I was very fond of this as a child. The problem with this tea set is this plastic is deteriorating like crazy. And before long, probably even the mint in box sets will only have the knives, forks, spoons, and plates. Well, the plastic, you can see down here, this one cup has already started some deterioration. So, but I think these are just wonderful. Again, I love the graphics here. And this was a set that I enjoyed immensely as a child. This is another item from my childhood. This is sort of a three-dimensional puzzle of Raggedy Ann and Andy. What is interesting about this is that it has a patent date of 1955. So this would have been purchased about 8 years after that. And it's a good example of how just because something has a date on it doesn't mean that that date is accurate as to when the thing was made or the thing was purchased. The other thing to keep in mind is this had probably been out of production for a couple of years when this was purchased for me. This is an item by a relatively minor manufacturer. When Bobbs Merrill took over the license, this license was probably not renewed. So this very likely was something that had been sitting on the shelf for 2 or 3 years before my parents purchased it. Now, the other thing that is interesting about this is that the graphics, well, not to my taste, are very much what would have been done in the 50s. This is a 1950s Wonder Book, and you can see how the graphics in that book are very similar to the graphics in this set, including the secondary characters of, say, Uncle Clem, Percy the policeman, Cleety the clown, Henny, and Frederica. So this is sort of a good example of 1950s graphics. So I did the pullout of the one Wonder Book, but this is a series of Wonder Books that would have been available in the 50s and early 60s. I remember these from my childhood because these were available at the supermarket. And as you can see, I had quite the collection of these. This would have been, of course, how I started to read. Some of these are very much sort of Georgene illustrations, and some of these, as I showed in that one instance, tend to be sort of a more 1950s interpretation of Raggedy Ann and Andy. So I do tend to refer to this as the second golden age of Raggedy Ann and Andy. In theory, what I'm showing you might be considered the third. It's all my childhood, so I have a tendency to lump it all together. But this is in the 70s, what was done by Determined Productions. And I think Determined Productions did an excellent job of reinterpreting Raggedy Ann and Andy for the time. In many ways, it's very true to the Gruelle illustrations, but at the same time, it's been adapted to what the sensibility of the 70s was. And I just think they did an excellent job. In fact, some of their things did have the Gruelle illustrations. This is this enormous coloring book. These sort of oversized coloring books were very popular in the 70s, as was this font, which I'm sure many of you are sort of familiar with. These figurines were made in Japan. They're basically paper mache. It's like a paper plaster composition. I think Determined Productions did a wonderful job of interpreting Raggedy Ann and Andy into 3 dimensions. These figurines with the motto on the bottom were, of course, very popular in the 70s. This Andy is part of a bookend set. Unfortunately, Raggedy Ann took a tumble, so she can't be here today. In addition to Determined Productions, one of the companies that was really very much part of the second or third golden era of Raggedy Ann and Andy was Hallmark. Hallmark reimagined Raggedy Ann and Andy for the 1970s, but in a way that was very much true to Raggedy Ann's roots. And they did a marvelous job of really committing to this and using this image on anything and everything you could possibly imagine could have a Raggedy Ann on it. There were party goods, cards, change purses, watches, just about anything that could have the image of Raggedy Ann had the image. Knickerbocker did try and sort of rip this image off, but they failed miserably by making everything very weak and watercolory. The blue of the skirt was really weak, the floral print was very pale, and the doll was not a success. So thank you very much for going on this journey down memory lane. I hope you have found it somewhat enjoyable and also somewhat informative. I am going to leave you with an art gallery of some of my finest work from nursery school and kindergarten, just to give you an idea of how much I had Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy on the brain. And I hope you all have a very, very safe and healthy 2020, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next convention.